Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Lucy Tongxin Lu. On behalf of the St. John Paul II National Shrine, its Executive Director, the Mission and Ministry team, and all the staff, I welcome you to the third annual celebration of Christianity Beyond East and West, a Christian celebration of the Lunar New Year. Happy Year of the Tiger. Our inaugural celebration of Christianity Beyond East and West was the last event in the shrine that was able to host in person in February 2020, before the world entered into a long and destabilizing period of the pandemic. The riches of our cultural and faith traditions, more than ever, are resources to draw from and live by as we seek to engage our daily challenges with courage and resilience. Following the footsteps of St. John Paul II, the shrine has cultural celebrations throughout the year. Today's event is particularly inspired by the saint's call to place culture at the center of the church's efforts in the new evangelization, and his view on the importance of inculturation. St. John Paul II's dedication to preserving his Polish culture and love of all human cultures show us that our cultural heritage is not accidental to who we are, but it is necessary to allow the incarnation of Christ to reach its fullness. We need to allow the power of the gospel to enter into our particular history and culture, and let Christ transform, purify, and bring all of who we are into perfection, while at the same time allowing culture to reveal something new about Christ's incarnation. Christ comes to each person precisely to liberate the person in order that he or she may be more human and may live a life that is at once more fulfilled on a human level, at the same time dedicated to the glory of God. Therefore, human culture is fundamental for faith, and faith is necessary for culture. It is with deep joy and gratitude that we can celebrate the Lunar New Year 2022 as a celebration of enduring hope. The peoples from various countries in Asia and their cultural traditions sustain their hope through fortitude, resilience, and perseverance in their daily lives. Even though this year's focus is on the Chinese culture, we're aware of so many other countries in Asia where they're also celebrating the Lunar New Year. We hope that we can bring different peoples and different cultures in Asia to the shrine next year in person to celebrate again the Lunar New Year. Now, I want to introduce you to today's MC of the program. Her name is Bakita Phun. She's from Hong Kong, a junior at Georgetown University studying international political economy. Please join me in welcoming Bakita.
Thank you, Lucy, for that really kind and warming introduction. I'm humbled to be here to celebrate the Lunar New Year at the St. John Paul II National Shrine, with people tuning in from all around the world. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the three panelists who will be speaking on the Chinese experience of resilience. As an international student from Hong Kong, with grandparents and parents who have sacrificed so much in order for me to be able to be here, this is a topic that is definitely close to my heart, and I'm really excited to be able to hear from all our distinguished guests today. I hope you are too. Our first guest is Dr. Joshua Brown, an assistant professor of theology at Mount St. Mary's University in Emmitsburg, Maryland. His research focuses on developing Catholic systematic theology in light of texts and themes from early Chinese philosophical traditions. He will talk about guarding what is essential, Christian endurance and Confucian courage. Secondly, we have Dr. Anthony Clark, a professor of Chinese history at Whitworth University in Spokane, Washington. One of his most widely read books is China's Saints, Catholic Martyrdom During the Qing. He is also a board member of US-China Catholic Association. He will talk about resilience and fortitude in the Chinese Catholic experience, which is a short history of Catholic martyrdom in China. Finally, Dr. Lucy Tongxin Lu is a member of the Mission and Ministry and our third panelist for today. She currently works at the St. John Paul II National Shrine and earned her doctorate from the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for the Studies on Marriage and Family. She will talk about resilience and fortitude in living out the Chinese ideal of filial piety. Two Catholic diplomats and thinkers, John C.H. Wu and Lu Zhengjiang. There will be a live Q&A session at the end. We strongly encourage you who are attending today to ask questions via the chat box at any time during the panel. At the end of the panel, I will ask the questions on your behalf and present them to the panelists. So please join me in first welcoming our panelist, Dr. Joshua Brown.
All right, well, thank you very much for that introduction. I appreciate it. Gong Xie Fa Chai, Xin Yan Kuai La. It's very nice to be here with you all again after last year. So in terms of today's talk, my task as I see it today is to kind of complement Dr. Clark's presentation, because he's going to speak about the embodied courage of Chinese Christians amid often horrendous circumstances. But I want to speak a little bit more theoretically about how we might make sense of Chinese Christian courage as both a Christian virtue and also as characteristically Chinese. And so what I would do with that is look at Confucian master Mengzi and his account of courage in order to develop reflections about how that vision resonates with the Christian virtue of fortitude. So to the text, Mengzi's most famous teaching on courage is found in Mengzi 2a2. This is also one of the longest and most complex passages in the Mengzi, so we'll just focus on the courage part. And in that passage, Mengzi talks about three kinds of courage. He speaks of a fellow named Bei Gongyo, who was always prepared to return the slightest perceived insult with deadly force. Even stabbing a prince or a common man didn't matter. Any threat to his person, perceived or otherwise, he would react with force. We also have Mengzi talking about a fellow named Meng Shishe, who would not throw his life away with both hands, but he would only attack an enemy after determining if the conditions for victory were favorable. And then we have Mengzi talking about Confucius's disciple Zhengzi as modeling a third kind of courage. And he quotes Zhengzi as saying that, quote, "If I look at myself and find I'm not upright, even if only a commoner in a wide street stood against me, I could not be unafraid to face him. But if I look within and find I am upright, then even if thousands and 10,000s of men stood before me, I could go to face them," end quote. So the key is that after describing these three forms of courage, Mengzi ranks them. So he says they're all three forms of courage, but not all three of them are advisable or really commendable. So Mengzi first kind of implies that Meng Shishe's courage was nobler than Bei Gongyo's courage, because Meng Shishe seeks to preserve his qi, or his life, really what he means, through being prudent. And we could guess that Mengzi would say that Bei Gongyo seeks to preserve his reputation, his ming, his name, and that way he's regarded, and or I should say the way that he's regarded. And so he makes an enemy of anyone around him who threatens his name or reputation as he sees it. And in this sense, Bei Gongyo seems to embody what Mengzi calls the vice of being fond of bravery, or haoyong, which is the willingness to engage in violence for trifling matters in ways that risk one's capacity to help one's parents when needed. And so in this sense, Bei Gongyo is brave only in the crudest sense of the term of facing difficulties. And that's what Mengzi calls petty courage, or xiaoyong, and it's not really commendable. Then we have Meng Shishe, where he is better because he protects something genuinely more important, the good of his own existence, his life. But in Mengzi's eyes, it's really Zhengzi who guards or protects what is most crucial, what he calls most essential, and that is Zhengzi's moral goodness. And the idea here is it's not that Zhengzi is willing to die for noble causes, but it's that Zhengzi examines his heart and to understand if he is truly committed to the good or not. And if he is committed to the good, then that knowledge of Zhengzi's uprightness is sufficient to help him face any difficulty. And so the suggestion is that Zhengzi is therefore guarding his moral commitment to being upright. And because of his genuine uprightness, he becomes willing to face any dangers that threaten to come to him because of what he believes or does. And so this means that for Mengzi, true courage is the virtue of being able to remain firmly committed to the good in the face of difficulties. Even Mengzi would say when the ultimate sacrifice is necessary. So this is really interesting because Mengzi does have a high regard for human life. And he notes in one passage that, quote, when it is possible for one to die and possible to not die, to accept death is an injury to courage, end quote. So he means being willing to die for a cause is not itself an act of courage. But at the same time, Mengzi also says elsewhere that, quote, I desire life and I desire righteousness, but if I cannot have both, I will give up life and take righteousness. I desire life, but there are things I want more than life, and I will not do anything improper to keep it. I hate death, but there are things I despise more than death. Thus, there are some sufferings I will not evade, end quote. So in the final tally, although life is a real good, it's not the ultimate good to Mengzi. There are difficulties we ought not evade when avoiding them would mean turning aside from the life of moral virtue. So guarding our chi is important, but guarding our moral character and goodness is most essential. And so Mengzi's virtue of courage is fundamentally a commitment to holding to the true good when it's required and sacrificing lesser goods when the same occurs. So sometimes lesser goods we might have to sacrifice are our reputation or our pride when our life is a greater good. But other times we might have to justly forfeit even our very lives or important freedoms in order to maintain our devotion to what is right, good, and noble. Now, the point of all this is not that Mengzi's conception of courage is all that different from the Christian notion of courage. I mean, if we drill down enough, right, there would be interesting and significant differences to be sure. That's a whole other conversation. Today, though, my emphasis is that in broad strokes, at least, Mengzi's conception of courage is actually quite familiar to the Christian. So for the Christian tradition, the exemplar of courage is the martyr, who shows the willingness to endure even death in order to cling to the truth and goodness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Importantly, the Christian tradition also has a long-standing norm that martyrdom is not to be sought so much as endured when necessary. So what I mean is, in the life of St. Polycarp of Smyrna, for example, we find that he assiduously sought to avoid death, if possible, during a time of persecution, although he was eventually martyred. So Christian martyrs ought not despise life. They ought not recklessly sacrifice themselves. Christian martyrdom ought to always recognize the goodness of life, while also realizing that, as Mengzi said, there are things to despise more than death. We can also note that for Christians, the truest form of courage is that of Christ. So the courage of Jesus appears in the Passion narratives through his accepting the cup of suffering and the agony of the garden, and his refusal to take up the sword at his arrest, and his withstanding the trials and punishments meant for wicked men despite his state of innocence. And I have a note very quickly, at the end of Luke, when the centurion looks up on the cross, he says about Jesus, truly he was an innocent man, right? And so Jesus's fidelity to the goodness of God, his divine mission, and his fidelity to his divine mission as son to enact that goodness of God by saving the world is also the truest form of courage the world has ever known. For no one has ever held to the fullness of righteousness more than the God-man, and no one ever endured more for the sake of things that ought to be loved more than the life of Jesus of Nazareth. But I say that to help point out that helps us understand that there's a considerable difference between, at least one considerable difference, between Mengzi's conception of courage and the Christian conception of courage. And that's the definition of what is righteous, or yi. So Mengzi could not possibly have imagined being willing to suffer for the sake of fidelity to the revelation of God, the divine law leading us to happiness, and the community founded by the incarnate word. It's not to say that Mengzi could not imagine suffering for moral or theological commitments, only that the specific definition of goodness and truth found in the Christian tradition would have escaped him. The idea that heaven could become man and act in perfect courage in service to perfect righteousness is not something that would have made sense to Mengzi. And this is not a small point, because it shows that from the Chinese perspective, gained through Mengzi at least, it's theoretically possible to appreciate the Christian account of courage, but no Chinese person or other culture for that matter would naturally agree that the Christian life in its specific terms is truly and fully virtuous. What I mean is, suffering for anything we happen to consider good is not necessarily courage. especially not for Mengzi. It's only when we have correctly identified the good. And so Christian courage is dependent on something more than just a conviction that Christianity contains morally virtuous teachings. For the true Christian idea of Christian righteousness includes, but is also more than just moral uprightness. It also means loving the triune God as the highest good, moving toward and enjoying a taste of communion with God. True righteousness in the Christian's context is fidelity to the God who has revealed himself through the elect people of Israel and through the life, death, and resurrection of the first century Jewish Palestinian innocent. And all this means that the Christian virtue of courage is really only possible through the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And put differently, the courage of an individual Christian must be transformed by grace in order to become Christian courage, since Christian courage holds to divine things in love and faithfulness. What this means for Chinese Christians then is really interesting. As Aquinas and the Scholastics would say, grace does not destroy, but perfects nature. And so the Chinese conceptions of courage and the virtues of courage are not nullified by the gospel, and nor is the courage of Chinese Christians transformed into a form of courage that is relieved of its Chinese character. Chinese Christian courage is truly Chinese courage, in other words. But the grace of God does lift this Chinese courage to be more than merely Chinese courage. For his grace allows Chinese courage to serve the most perfect understanding of righteousness, the most perfect articulation of goodness. And so in that way, divine grace can perfect Chinese virtues of courage to become Christian courage while these maintain their Chinese characters. And so what I'm trying to emphasize here, I'll wrap up my comments with this, is that the stories of Chinese Christians and the continuing examples of both the extraordinary and mundane courage we find in Christian communities of Chinese cultural heritage, these can and should be embraced as part of two stories. So on one level, Chinese Christians carry on the proud legacy of the people of the dragons, right? To the compelling wisdom and virtuous commitments of forebears like Mengzi and Zhengzi. In this sense, Chinese Christians should be embraced as exemplars of the Chinese way of life, showing us all the capacity of Chinese culture to inculcate genuine virtue and profound courage. But of course, we should also attend to the ways in which Chinese Christians are testimonies to Christian courage. And I don't mean this only that because Chinese Christians have shown the capacity to bear burdens that many contemporary Christians could not withstand, especially in Western cultures. I mean also that Chinese Christians are part of the beautiful story of Christian courage and have much to teach us about what courage looks like when transformed by the divine grace. So I'm particularly sure that the Chinese Christians can help the Church Universal to consider how God's grace unites culture with redemption, perfecting rather than destroying nature's gifts. But of course, that's a larger question than we have time for. The upshot for now is that Chinese Christian courage is also part of the story of Christian courage and stands as a testimony to how the Christian life is a participation in Christ and is perfected by the communion with the triune God. Although historically, even today, we have those who wish to pit Chinese culture and Christian commitment against each other as opposing identities, we have really good reason to resist such accounts, if only we have the courage to do so. So thank you. You excuse the pun, but so thank you very much. I believe we're transferring Dr. Clark now. Yeah.
All right. Let me just praise this convention of bow ties. And now I'll share the screen and hopefully everything will work well. Can someone indicate whether or not my screen is seen? Dr. Liu, okay, excellent. Well, I'm just honored and grateful for this invitation to participate in this panel on the topic of Christianity beyond East and West, a title that derives from the important book by the same name by John C.H. Wu Jingxiong, published in 1951. In his book, Wu provides a beautifully crafted reflection on his conversion to Roman Catholicism, but embedded in Wu's, and here's an image of the book cover, But embedded within his remarks is what scholars identify as a Hegelian dialectic that juxtaposes the intellectual and religious sensibilities of China and the West. So I've been asked to provide, quote, a short history of Catholic martyrdom in China. I wrote a whole book about that, so a short history is rather difficult. A topic that, not surprisingly, offers an opportunity to compare Chinese and Western notions of death and martyrdom. Much in the same vein of John Wu's approach to such cultural contrasts. So I'll divide my comments into three short sections. First, a description of traditional Chinese views on death and martyrdom, a kind of thesis. Second, a description of Western views of death and martyrdom, a kind of antithesis. And third, Chinese Catholic views on death and martyrdom, a kind of synthesis. So I'll begin with an account of a parade through the streets of Fu'an and Fujian, the location of a Dominican mission during the Ming and Qing dynasties. 1368 was the beginning of the Ming, and 1911 is the end of the Qing. In 1644, the main streets were crowded by onlookers gathered to observe a procession of more than 300 men wearing Catholic habits and vestments, some wearing makeup and the clothing of women. The parade was staged in order to mock the local Spanish Dominican friars and Chinese Catholics under their care. The leader of the pageant was a man costumed to look like Christ, shouting, "I am the God of the Christians who came to the world for them." Now, following the Christ figure was a long line of people masquerading as Christians, carrying rosaries, crosses, and intoning Catholic prayers that they had memorized for the event. At the end of the procession were three men on horses dressed in the Dominican habit to represent the friars stationed there at Fu'an: Father Juan Garcia, Father Francisco Diaz, and Father Francisco de Capillas. Now, in order to condemn them more effectively, actually, the three impersonators wore masks with enormous noses to emphasize their foreignness. As they passed through the streets, they announced to the crowds, "I am Father so-and-so. I preach and advise you to do wicked deeds. And to be a follower, you must be baptized." Finally, the three men impersonating the missionaries dismounted their horses and acted out a scene depicting them as lascivious predators who baptized women only to enlist them as private concubines. Now, this event precipitated such public animosity against the Spanish missionaries that on January 15th, 1648, Francisco de Capillas was beheaded as a criminal, and his body was tossed rather unceremoniously outside the city wall. His humiliations, tortures, and eventual martyrdom inspired an instant culture of veneration among local Catholics. And in 2000, he was finally canonized by Pope St. John Paul II. Western accounts of his death are laden with standard hagiographical tropes, such as the recurrent description of his beheading while kneeling on the ground and praying the sorrowful mysteries of the Rosary. But while Western readers of his martyrdom generally herald his death as holy and heroic, this assessment is not common among non-Christian Chinese. Several examples from China's early texts underscore the challenges that Catholic missionaries in China encountered when attempting to convey the Western Christian understanding of death and martyrdom. No equivalent Chinese character could be found to render the Western word martyr into Chinese. And when scouring through China's classical works to find an analog for translating this term, nothing was evident. The early missionaries finally landed on the character shun to represent the Catholic term martyr into Chinese. But despite the fact that it seemed to be the closest possible word, this character actually denoted sacrificial victims, typically slaves, who were killed in order to serve their masters in the afterlife. So little or nothing about this Chinese term was viewed positively in China. To die as a shun was to die as a victim of slavery and servitude with no potential, this is a key point, with no potential for reward after life. Now, I'm visiting Mencius because of Dr. Brown. Jesuit missionaries eventually combined the character shun, sacrificial victim, with Dao, which implied a way or a virtue, a term that was first used by the Confucian philosopher Mencius, who had added this character to describe those who had sacrificed themselves for the sake of virtue, or yi, as Dr. Brown mentioned. Mencius's term shundao detached the term shun from its pejorative meaning, but it still was a term far removed from the Christian understanding of a martyr. So what happened then was that Chinese Catholics became savvy to a host of new ideas and terms quite unfamiliar to their fellow Chinese. That is, Catholic missionaries had changed the meaning of such terms as shundao, changes in meaning that required a good deal of explanation to new Christians. Perhaps more difficult than translating the term martyr into Chinese was transforming the common Chinese idea that there is no permanent afterlife into a Christian belief in an eternal soul. So even more, Chinese convictions held that death was by and large a bad thing to be avoided by any means. I would say arguably no other culture than China has invested more intellectual resources to discovering the arts of long life, Changshou, and immortality, Buxiu. And even a body of rituals was created to entice the soul to return to its body immediately after death. Two things are important to know about China's traditional view of death and afterlife. First, life is always preferred over death. And second, the soul eventually disappears. So as a side note, China has held that humans have two souls in addition to a body, both of which quickly or slowly dissolve into nothingness once separated from the body. Now, among ancient China's most famous poems is one entitled Zhao Hun, or the Summons of the Soul, which describes a ritual intended to call a soul back at the moment it separates from the body at death. The entire ritual can be summarized in one line of the poem. O soul, come back. Why have you left your old abode and fled to the earth's far corners, deserting the place of your delight to meet all those things of evil omen after life? The afterlife then is described as a place where malevolent beasts with, quote, jaws ever ready to rend up mortal men. In other words, traditional Chinese and Christian views of life and death are inverted. For China's non-Christians, life is a heaven compared to the sufferings after death. And for Western Christians, life is suffering compared to the possibility of heaven after death. So to return again to the Christian idea of martyrdom, martyrdom is a portal into an eternal heaven. Whereas for the popular Chinese view, it is at worst a sacrificial death of the enslaved, or in a better light, a death honored by its sacrifice for a virtual cause. No matter the reason one is martyred, the shun or shundao dies and her or his soul enters a realm of terror. So I mention all of this to highlight just how different the martyrdom of Francisco de Capillas was viewed by Christian and non-Christian Chinese. Now, unlike most of China's non-Christian Christians, missionaries and Chinese Catholics were familiar with the narratives of the Gospels. Matthew chapter 10, for example, has this passage: "Behold, I am sending you like sheep in the midst of wolves, so be shrewd as serpents and simple as doves. But be aware of people, for they will hand you over to courts and scourge you in their synagogues. You will be hated by all because of my name, but whoever endures to the end will be saved." Now, and by saved, the gospel informs its readers that Christians who suffer in life can be assured of an eternal paradise after death. For Chinese Catholics, the anticipation of a delightful afterlife transformed their behaviors, making them in most cases quite willing to endure torture and martyrdom for the expected rewards. Resilience and fortitude had been converted from a Confucian view that applied these ideals only to life into a view that made them behaviors leading to a blissful eternity in heaven. So I'll provide two accounts of Chinese Catholics who suffered martyrdom in ways that illustrate a view of death and afterlife much changed from the conventional views held by non-Christian Chinese. The young catechist, Xi Zhuzi, the character here says Zhuzi Chi, that's not how it was pronounced, it was Xi. So Xi Zhuzi, a catechist from Hebei, converted to Catholicism at the age of 17. His family was Buddhist. His parents actually tried to dissuade him from converting by denying him food. But he was persistent and he continued to attend Mass despite his family's protests. During the Boxer Uprising, ended in 1900, she was seized by Boxers and asked if he was a Christian. After answering yes and refusing to apostatize by worshiping at a nearby Buddhist temple, Xi Zhuzi was tortured while he knelt and drew a cross on the ground. Famously, he said to his torturers, "You can proceed with your cutting, go ahead and slice me to pieces, but each cut, each piece of flesh, each drop of blood will tell you that I am a Christian." Another Chinese Catholic martyr, Mary Zhu, suffered a dramatic martyrdom during the Boxer Uprising. And her image is actually featured on churches all over China, on the walls and sometimes behind the altar. On July 20th, 1900, Mary Zhu was in the chapel while Boxers and Qing troops besieged her village. And when the attackers fired their guns into the praying crowd, one of the priests, a French Jesuit, began to recite the act of contrition, knowing that they had reached their final moments. In order to allow the priest to finish his prayer, Mary Zhu stood in front of him and extended her arms in a cross as she received the bullets aimed at the Jesuit. Witnesses reported that her body fell onto the altar rail as she died. Chinese Catholics such as Xi and Mary Zhu were often heard to exclaim in Chinese, "Tian Tang Kai Men," or "Heaven opens its doors," moments before dying, underscoring the Christian belief in the afterlife had transformed how the Chinese Catholics viewed their deaths into a positive rather than negative way. So let's work toward a conclusion here. So let me just conclude with one quick account of how the Chinese Catholic understanding of martyrdom represents a synthesis of Chinese and Western views and practices. In a remote Shanxi village called Liuhecun, a Catholic village that was converted to Christianity by Franciscans, a Chinese priest, Father Wang Shiwei, was tortured and killed for his Catholic faith in 1970. After Red Guards had summoned local Catholics to what they called an eradicate religion assembly at the cathedral, Father Wang exhorted the gathered Christians to, quote, resist cowardice and remain faithful to their beliefs. For this, he was resisted and placed in a cell where his body was chained to a ceiling beam and tortured until his public execution. Wang's martyrdom is still celebrated by Chinese Catholics in Shanxi province, but most relevant to my point is that his resilience, fortitude, and martyrdom are remembered in a very traditional Chinese fashion. His nephew, Wang Jingshan, erected a small Chinese-style shrine dedicated to the local veneration of his uncle. On the altar in front of Wang Shiwei's photo are several items commonly placed on Buddhist and Taoist altars: porcelain flower vases, bottles of rice wine, and red envelopes containing cash offerings. And framing the martyr priest's image at this Catholic shrine is a pair of couplets that read, "Above he was hanged by chains and could not lie down. Below he was tied to the ground and could not stand up." So this syncretic shrine dedicated to a modern Christian martyr mixes Catholicism, and popular Chinese religions, and really represents how Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism have not been entirely abandoned in Chinese Catholic culture, but have been merged together in a way that does not compromise Orthodox Catholic belief. It rather adopts the traditional ideals of resilience and fortitude and Christianizes them in order to emphasize the Catholic belief in the permanent nature of the soul and the possibility of eternity in heaven. Do I have 3 minutes left, or am I out of time? I think I have about 1 minute left of my remarks, so it's okay I'll finish here. So let me end with a quote from Mencius that expresses a shared belief of both non-Christian and Chinese Christians who revere the best of their own culture. And I think Dr. Brown mentioned this. There are things a person wants more than life, and there are things he or she loathes more than death. During the canonization of the French missionary who was martyred in China, Jean-Gabriel Perboire, Pope John Paul II compared his death to the passion and cross of Christ. He recounted the protracted tortures that he endured before his execution by slow strangulation in 1840. But the overall message that the Pope was attempting to express was that the Christian promise of the cross is a reward of unending paradise rather than vicious beasts that await the soul after death, described in ancient Chinese poems and rituals. For China's Catholics, Confucian virtues are still admired, and even many cultural practices such as traditional shrines have been incorporated into Catholic use. But all these elements of non-Christian China have been reframed into a narrative of hope that one can witness from the pews of any Catholic church in China today. So I'll end with that. Thank you, everyone. I hope the slides worked effectively, and I will stop screen share.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark, for your wonderful and inspiring presentation. Also, Dr. Joshua Brown, thank you very much for both of your presentations. And today, I'm very honored for the opportunity to share with you two of my favorite diplomats and thinkers, Zhang C.H. Wu, an English-speaking Chinese diplomat in the Vatican from 1947 to 49, and another one, Lu Zhengxiang, a French-speaking Chinese diplomat in Russia and Belgium from 1893 to 1920, who later became a Benedictine monk. So I have chosen these two Chinese diplomats because their public lives beautifully witness to the unity of their Catholic faith and their Chinese culture. They were totally Catholic, totally Chinese, and totally themselves in carrying out their diplomatic programs in very perilous political situations. I suggest and argue that we can better understand their vision for their country if we see these two men as weaving a Chinese tunic for Christ. They brought their cultural heritage, especially the Confucian ideal of filial piety, into the church. And in the meantime, continue to love their country and their parents, not in place of God, but in Him and through Him. So the structure of my presentation is threefold. First, I would like to explain through the lens of this time-honored Confucian tradition, namely filial piety, in what ways and how these two diplomats and thinkers were both totally Catholic and totally Chinese. Then I would like to focus on how these two Chinese diplomats apply the spirit of Confucian filial piety to the serving and loving of the Heavenly Father in their vocation to public service as diplomats. Lastly, I want to conclude based on these two concrete examples, how we all can have this filial confidence in God's providence. And that confidence can fill us with an audacious and invincible hope. So let's begin with our two protagonists. So who are Zhang C.H. Wu and Lu Zhengxiang? For the purpose of our presentation today, which focuses on filial piety and Chinese diplomatic history here, It is important to know that both of them have lived during the newborn Republic of China. Dr. Clark mentioned about Boxer Revolution in 1900, so it's right after that. So the historical context really shaped our two diplomats. It was a time when the last Chinese emperor abdicated in 1912, and China started her first experiment in representative government by a people who had been living under imperial rule for more than 2,000 years. So amidst this overwhelming transition from an old empire to a new republic, from the year 1911 to 1949, there emerged a legion of courageous men and women who dedicated themselves to a complete rejuvenation of China in every sphere of life. So we can glimpse this youthful and ardent zeal for serving the new China from Zhang Zichu's letter to his American mentor when Zhang Wu was studying in Paris in 1921. He says, as a Chinese, I have a country to save. I have a people to enlighten. I have a race to uplift. I have a civilization to modernize. So neither Zhang Zichu nor Lu Zhengxiang had any ambitions to be statesmen, but historical events guided by divine providence offered them unique opportunities to be educated in the family tradition of old China and also to be equipped with modern education of the West. So in order to understand this unique combination of their educational background, it is very important to mention the old method of Confucian system before the advent of modern Chinese education. So from the Han Dynasty 200 BC to the Qing Dynasty around 1900 AD, the imperial examinations, or keju, were an essential part of the Chinese government administration. So theoretically, any male adult in China, regardless of his wealth or social status, could become a high-ranking government official by passing the imperial exams, which was based on Confucian studies. So the Confucian examination system was abolished during the Qing Dynasty's attempt for modernization. However, the ethos of Confucian thinking and educating children were still intact in the late 1900s and early 20th century. So for example, when Zhang Zichu was educated as a young kid, he was educated by a Confucian scholar, in particularly filial piety at home at the age of 6. And he also started to learn English in primary school at the age of 9, because English at the time was already the second language in all schools in the beginning of 20th century. And our other protagonist, Lu Zhengxiang, almost 30 years older than Zhang Zichu, was also educated in the Confucian classics at home, but he never completed his education for the imperial exams. Instead, Lu was enrolled at the age of 13 in the foreign language schools in Shanghai and Beijing and became fluent in French, which enabled him to be a translator to China's embassy in St. Petersburg, Russia. So both of them were equipped with Western languages and ways of thinking at a very early age. Nevertheless, Zhang Zichu and Lu Zhengxiang were thoroughly Chinese, and they were imbued with Chinese culture. Already being appointed by the Pope as the abbot of a Benedictine monastery in Belgium, Lu Zhengxiang wrote in his memoir in French entitled Souvenir et Pensée, I am a Confucianist because that moral philosophy in which I was brought up profoundly penetrates the nature of man and traces clearly his line of conduct towards his creator, towards his parents, and towards his fellows, individuals and society. So also Zhang Zichu wrote in his autobiography, Beyond East and West, Confucian tradition, as well as Taoism, Buddhism, constitute my moral and religious background and form an integral part of the development of my spiritual life. They are an important portion of the natural dowry with which God has endowed me in preparation for my marriage with Christ. So for both Zhang C.H. Wu and Lu Zhengxiang, the Confucian spirit led them to see the evident superiority of Christianity and of the Catholic Church, holding a living treasure from which believers from century to century can draw riches, ancient and new. For them, Confucian doctrine is not a rival to Christianity, but it is profound human culture rooted in the principles of the natural law. And this means that it can be raised up in grace. Just like Dr. Brown said, nature doesn't destroy, grace doesn't destroy nature, but perfects nature as dimensions of a full Catholic vision and existence. So when Zhang C.H. Wu and Lu Zhengxiang became Catholics, they naturally applied the idea of filial piety to their relationship with God. In the thought and practice of Confucianism, filial piety and the work of personal perfection are the real education of statesmanship. In order that young people may learn to develop their intelligence, judgment, and heart, and thereby to school themselves for social and civic and political life, it is in the first place necessary that they should honor their parents. A young Chinese must strive within his or her family to learn how to govern themselves and to prepare themselves for the government of a family, for the government of a city, of a province, or even of the state, if that's what God calls them to be. So let us briefly look at how Lu Zhengxiang and Zhang C.H. Wu strive to live out the ideal of filial piety in their political careers. So we'll first begin with Lu Zhengxiang. According to his own judgment, Lu always put into practice the best of his ability, the testament of his own father, which is expressed in a single Chinese word, Tian, trust in heaven. Lu's father gave him the best preparation for his diplomatic career. Lofty unselfishness and social development of the natural virtues, which can only be taught in the bosom of the family. When Lu joined the Chinese legation at St. Petersburg in 1892, he met his first chief and mentor, and his name is Xu Jingcheng, an upright and clear-sighted statesman who taught him based on the Confucianist principles to live for others, to pass from private to public life, and to be a statesman, a politician in the best sense of the word. So the first principle Chief Xu gave Lu was that of not attaching oneself to the declining regime, neither to enter into it nor to condemn it, but to confine oneself to doing one's duty. Lu courageously carried out what Xu Jingcheng, his chief and his mentor, spiritual father, had envisioned for him. Even after the chief was unjustly condemned to death by the imperial Chinese government, out of pride and jealousy, Lu did not desert his duty in the legation and continued to serve the country as Minister of Foreign Affairs and twice as the Prime Minister of the Parliament. He was the head of the Chinese delegation at the peace conference in Paris in 1919. Due to unjust encroachment of Chinese land by foreign powers, Lu refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles, making him an instant hero among the people of China, and also making China the only country that did not sign the treaty. So like Lu Zhengxiang, Wu also viewed his diplomatic career as a sign of being really called by God to pursue justice through public service. So for Wu Jingxiong, or Zhang C.H. Wu, in the spring of 1945, he attended the inaugural United Nations conference in San Francisco for 3 months and was the principal drafter of the UN Charter in Chinese. Later that same year, President Chiang Kai-shek appointed Wu to serve as China's ambassador to the Vatican. So in 1946, Wu and his whole family, except the oldest son of his 13 children, who was married, sailed to Rome. As a diplomat, Wu presented his credentials to, at the time, Pope Pius XII, making him the first time in the diplomatic history of the Holy See that the Chinese ever represented a Chinese Catholic ever represented a non-Catholic nation. So Wu described his public service as the diplomacy of love and told the Pope that I am keenly aware of the importance of my mission and of my own unworthiness of it. For my mission is nothing less to confirm and increase the intimate relationship between the greatest spiritual power of human society and the people of the oldest Oriental culture. So during Wu's diplomacy as diplomacy of love, he shows such filial affection towards the Holy Father. So I can give you one anecdote, one small example. So one day, Monsignor Montini, at the time, the Secretary of the State, who later became Pope Paul VI, asked Wu to present his whole family to the Holy Father and told him that a photograph would be taken of the Holy Father together with the Wu family. Wu obediently presented his wife, 12 of his children, together with a daughter-in-law and a godson to the Holy Father. So when it was time to take the picture with him, Wu didn't feel right that the Holy Father was standing with his family, because motivated by his Chinese sense of filial respect, especially to the father, Wu was moved to pull up a chair and insisted that the Holy Father should be sitting like a father in the Chinese family. So later, Wu was told that it was the only time that the Pope was ever pictured sitting with a private family. So I show you this photo here that Pope Pius XII is sitting for the first time with the Wu family, because this is out of respect as a practice of the filial piety. So before an urgent and dangerous trip to China in 1949, Wu wrote to Holy Father and asked him to pray for him, that he may be guided by the Holy Spirit in the world of politics. So Wu wrote to the Holy Father, Holy Father, pray for me that I may face my tasks fearlessly in the interest of love and justice and for the glory of Christ and his church. So he said, by nature, I'm a weak child, afraid of danger and sacrifice. Only the grace of God can make me strong and ready to make sacrifices whenever they are called for. So supported by the prayer of the Holy Father, Wu accepted a very difficult position of being the Prime Minister of Justice offered to him by the Prime Minister at the time, with a spirit of martyr, even inspired his friends to join him. Even though the cabinet fell shortly after Wu's acceptance, he still secured a moral victory of profound courage and self-sacrifice. So for Lu Zhengxiang and for Jiang C.H. Wu, the Confucian ideal of filial piety seemed to predispose them to perceive God's will in the trials of their lives. Indeed, seeing all things in life as graces coming from the hands of God, our loving Father. So the Chinese character for filial piety is called xiao. It symbolizes the attitude of, so this is the Chinese character of xiao. It's symbolized by a vigorous son carrying the old father on his back. And this means that bearing on himself and in himself, the son, all the goodness, the experience, and the history of the human race, while with an indescribable respect and a profound gratitude, transmitting it at the same time nobly and valiantly to the future. So the lives of our two diplomats can show us that the revelation and redemption of Jesus Christ is the great meeting place of the ways, the unique point where filial piety of children and men is opened up to a divine filial piety. So Jesus Christ has shown us and give us the right to be children of God, and reunites the human creatures with our Father who is in heaven. So we don't need to be diplomats or even to be Chinese diplomats to practice filial piety. Everyone everyone can and should be open to the fact that God is our loving Father. So so through their great examples, I hope we can all be encouraged to maintain a child's heart and to be rooted in the hope of the fatherland, our true home. So that with that, we can move on to the Q&A session. I'll invite Bakita back. So feel free to ask any questions to any of the panelists that we're here.
Great, thank you all so much. That was such an engaging discussion, and I learned so much about filial piety, Chinese culture, tradition, going back from ages ago till the present day. And so the first question that we have is actually to Dr. Liu, right next to me. Do you think the examples of John C. Chu and Lu Zhengxiang have anything to teach us about the new evangelization? Something similar that you mentioned in your opening speech. Love to hear a little bit more about what you think.
Okay, new evangelization, yes. So for Lu Zhengxiang and also for Jiang C. Chu, their understanding of evangelization, of course, primarily meaning evangelizing those who have never heard of the gospel, especially in the Far East, in China, but also it also means that we can re-evangelize people in the West. So I think both of them offer great living and concrete examples that when we live out our faith in an enculturated way, we can inspire people regardless of their backgrounds, even in the West, of the true nature of Christianity, which is beyond East and West. So they offer a refreshing example of the universality of Christ and the gospel message. So it can be enculturated at any time, even our 21st century, post-pandemic time. So that's my initial thought. Does any of you want to add or? Okay.
Great, thanks, Dr. Liu. So the next question we have is for Dr. Brown. We'd like to ask if, first, what are the names of the philosophers that you reference, and are there any specific works that you would recommend? And then following on from that, could you elaborate a little bit on the relationship between courage and duty to family? Something that Dr. Liu also talked about, but perhaps in a little bit more depth based on the understanding of courage and Confucian identity that you've mentioned.
Yes, sir. So one in the chat, I saw the question. I posted the transliteration of the names there, and I suggest the translation of the Mengzi from Brian W. Van Norden. He's just the best Mengzi specialist working today in the West. I mean, DC Lau also has a very good older translation from like the 70s, like that, from Penguin. It's a cheaper, I suppose, maybe, but the Van Norden I think is really, really good. In terms of connection between courage and the family, I mean, it's similar to what Dr. Clark was talking about. You know, you don't have the kind of afterlife context of martyrdom, you could say, in early China. The essential kind of the issues you'd face are, like, on one hand, very political, like where you'd have a minister would have to face, you know, being courageous in front of his ruler and saying the truth, speaking the truth to power kind of thing, and being willing to have his head cut off, right? So there's that. And also the kind of courage you have within the family, because of course the father is a figure who governs the son, right? And there's multiple forms of courage that Mengzi especially talks about, the kind of courage that to be able to correct our father, to help our father pursue moral goodness when he may not do so. There's also the kind of courage, or I should say how the family tempers courage, so that I do not risk my life unnecessarily for the sake of being able to still maintain caring for my parents, to understand my relationship to my parents and the need I have to give them love and service as the highest kind of good within this life that I can use to understand the other relative goodness of things and when to let them go, right? So to summarize that, you might say that for early Confucians like Mengzi, I think the family dynamics and the family commitments are part of the goods that we have that are very high level goods that determine what it means to live well, to determine the life of virtue, and courage is required to live a life of the family.
So someone like Bai Gongyo, of course, right, he'll throw his life away, risk not being able to care for his parents because he has xiaoyong, he has little courage, small petty courage, rather than the great courage of being good sons. So that's one thing I'd say. I don't know, Dr. Clark may have things to add to that, but.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. That's very, very insightful and relevant till today. So Dr. Clark, if you wanted to add anything to what Dr. Brown said, but also we have a question for you from the audience. Do Chinese philosophers make any significant connection between the virtues of courage and patience? And if any of you want to join in, please feel free to answer that question as well.
Do the Chinese philosophers make connections to courage and patience? Well, certainly, as Dr. Brown mentioned, I mean, all through the Mencius, even through the Analects of Confucius, all through Confucian texts, courage, yong, is a crucial virtue. In fact, during the imperial era in China, Chinese troops wore the character on their uniforms, yong, courage. To symbolize what is required of being a soldier on the field. And what's interesting, and here's something I just want to underline, and that is this idea of these Confucian ideas being manifest in a Christian way in China, in a Catholic way. If you're ever in a Chinese church in China hearing Mass, it is extremely common to hear the priest in his homily quote Mencius or Confucius. And how often do our priests in the United States quote Aristotle? You know, the sort of the classics of our own Western past, I should say. But there is a very strong sense. And in fact, when Lu Zhengxiang wrote his memoirs, he writes about the marriage of Confucianism and Catholicism. And he says, what China can give to the church is the ideas expressed in Confucianism. And interestingly, he said, what the church can give to China is monasticism. Of course, he was a Benedictine monk, and at the very end of his writings, Lu Zhengxiang argues that this monastic ideal would serve as a kind of leaven in Chinese society. And the other thing, let me just say, to sort of build upon this, is the last thing I'll say by way of remarking about this relationship between these Confucian ideas and Chinese Catholicism and hope and virtue. That is, there's a saying in China that is very anti-Christian. It's 多一个基督徒便少一个中国人. For every Christian, Chinese person who becomes a Christian, then you have one less Chinese person, right? And the idea was that becoming a Christian removes you from being authentically Chinese. You change your culture. What's interesting about that is if you're in China, it's the Catholics, it's the Chinese who are preserving, in my mind, more of these old traditions than the rest of society. Wearing white at funerals, the example I showed of the shrine at the home, the nephew of the Chinese priest who died in Shanxi province. Chinese Catholics really have preserved traditions and preserved these Chinese ideals in ways that one doesn't see in most of Chinese society. So it's kind of ironic that saying one more Christian is one less Chinese is actually not true. So anyway, there's more to be said about all of these things, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, I really think that speaks to the overall themes that I've heard from each of the panelists, that it's not in contention, that it's not mutually exclusive to be Chinese and Catholic. And I think that's such an interesting quote and such an interesting dilemma that people face nowadays. And through the discussions and through all this amazing research and writing that all of these three panelists have done, we're sort of really being able to embrace that difference and also realize that there's more to develop and that it isn't, you know, one more Christian means one less Chinese person, as embodied in the people here and the performances and the performers that you'll see very soon. And so finally, we have a little bit of time for our last question, and this is in general for any of the panelists. Considering the great importance of courage and fortitude in Chinese philosophy, how do you think that the thinkers that you mentioned in your respective sharings would react to the Beatitudes?
Actually, do you mind the middle part?
Yes, sure. Considering the importance of courage and fortitude in Chinese philosophy, how do you think thinkers would react to the Beatitudes?
Yeah, since I'm closer to the moderator here, I can take a stab at it first. So Beatitudes, if I remember correctly, blessed the poor in spirit. So those are paradoxical blessings revealed by Jesus in the Gospels. So they are definitely not something that we read in Chinese philosophies, which is a non-revelatory, or yeah, it's human. So it's, I'm not going to say that there will not be surprise or anything. It will be a surprise, but at the same time a fulfillment. It's elevating the ideal to a life of grace and the kingdom of God. So when Dr. Brown is saying that grace doesn't destroy nature but perfects it, so this can be a great occasion for the philosophy, Chinese philosophy on courage and fortitude to find their anchor in the Word of God that will never be destroyed by any of the powers, dark powers in the world. So that's my initial thought.
I'll say there's a tension actually in the classical text, at least. So on the one hand, when punishment comes from heaven and or reward comes from heaven, it's based on, you know, moral failure or moral success, right? Especially in texts like the not Mengzi, but Mozi, sorry. But at the same time, like the Mengzi, for example, there's also this awareness that the world is in a state of, the phrase that Mengzi uses is 天下无道, right? The empire of the world has lost the Tao, right? And so in that sense, you have in that circumstance of the world losing the Tao, you have a chance where the reward from heaven and the punishment, all that is not always to be trusted, right? Because now we face the circumstances where a righteous man may have to lose his life to testify to the truth, for example, right? So I think the kind of the irony of Christ, right, where the poor are blessed, or the poor in spirit are blessed, or the meek inherit the earth, right? That also speaks to a profound Christian sense of the way the world has lost the Tao, at least especially in Luke's version of the gospel, right? And how the Tao is being set right, like the world is being made correct, set back on its axis in a way, right, through the ministry of Christ. And so I think from a Chinese perspective, that points out that Jesus' Beatitudes, that they become true in as much as they're tied to the regeneration and the grace of transformation that's coming in Christ himself. So I'm not sure they would have understood that, right? But if we could explain that context of meeting the world of sin and what Christ is bringing about through his entry into that world of sin, I think the classical philosophers would have a very great appreciation for what Christians mean by the Beatitudes.
So let me say something a bit circuitous. The thing about the Beatitudes is they're when in China, Catholics or Protestant Christians write, they put in beautiful calligraphy passages from Scripture. Typically, the Beatitudes are not reproduced. Not that they're not believed in or beloved, but typically they're not reproduced. Other things like Corinthians 13, you know, this whole idea, or Corinthians, the discussion of love. This is so common because I think in the Chinese, even the Chinese Catholic context, the emphasis in what I think speaks to many, especially non-Catholic Christians or non-Christian Chinese or non-Catholic Chinese, is passages that relate to this life. So very briefly, when Confucius was asked, you know, the Analects of Confucius are, it's this book about a student will ask the master, Confucius, about a certain topic. And when Confucius is asked about death, his answer is very telling. And his answer is, I don't know enough about life to talk about life. How could I talk about death? Something I have no idea about. So the Confucian instinct is to resist discussions of the afterlife. and Confucius isn't saying, I mean, actually later he says, you should make sacrifices to the spirits after life, just in case they're there. So he's something of a genuine agnostic, Confucius. Matteo Ricci, the great Jesuit missionary, said one of the strengths of Confucianism is that it didn't talk about death. Thus, it didn't make the errors that it would have made had it talked about death. So Ricci was like, this is excellent. I'm glad they didn't talk about death, so Confucianism works well for us. So my point then is that passages that Christians, Chinese Catholics, write and put on their walls typically refer to this life. And the Beatitudes are beloved, but I think typically they emphasize a kind of what I would call, this is almost like a horrible thing to say, but I think there's a sort of cultural DNA that emphasizes life over the afterlife. Not that Chinese Christians deny the afterlife. Absolutely, they died for the afterlife in martyrdom. But there is a kind of an emphasis more perhaps on the this worldliness and how we enact our Christian faith here. That said, yes, the Beatitudes, beautiful passage, and the Chinese translation of them is quite lovely if you can read Chinese.
Wow, great. I think that's a perfect way to end our panel in the first part of the programming for today. Again, thank you both. Thank you all, Dr. Clark, Dr. Brown, and Dr. Liu, for all your interesting sharings. I think you really highlighted the idea of beyond East and West and towards the body of Christ. And I think, you know, as the discussion mentioned, you know, our faith is really like a both and. And I think this discussion really highlighted it's both the culture, both the history, and also the spirituality and the rich tradition that comes with the Catholic Church and also comes with Chinese culture and the Chinese nation. And so moving on, we will have the second part of our program featuring musical performances and poetry. So first, we will watch a traditional Lunar New Year song prepared by Linda Mealy Lohman, who is the President Emeritus of China Garden Society in St. Paul, Minnesota. She will be teaching us a Chinese song called Gongxi, or congratulations. You can follow the lyrics of the song and all the other songs and poems that you'll hear today in the link that we sent out earlier today. So I would like to welcome Linda.
你好, my name is Linda Mealy Lohman, and I'm the past president of the Minnesota China Friendship Garden Society and the beautiful China Garden behind me in St. Paul, Minnesota. 我是苗丽莲，我是明州中国友好花园协会的会长。Happy Chinese New Year to everyone. Happy Year of the Tiger. 恭喜发财. You may know that 恭喜 is a traditional greeting on Chinese New Year time. And so I'd like to sing a song about 恭喜, the 恭喜 song. I'll sing it first and then we'll talk about it and then we'll sing it all together. 每条大街小巷，每个人的嘴里，见面第一句话就是恭喜恭喜，恭喜恭喜恭喜你呀，恭喜恭喜恭喜你。That's the 恭喜 song. So what does it mean? It means on all of the big major streets and the small alleyways, the first words out of everyone's mouth when they meet on Chinese New Year Day is 恭喜. Can everyone say that? 恭喜, 恭喜. Great. Why don't you sing along with that part when we get to that? 每条大街小巷，每个人的嘴里，见面第一句话就是恭喜恭喜，恭喜恭喜恭喜你呀，恭喜恭喜恭喜你。恭喜恭喜恭喜你呀，恭喜恭喜恭喜你。谢谢大家 Happy New Year 春节快乐再见。
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for teaching us that song, Linda. So next, we have 3 piano pieces brought by our very own Ma Gege. Ma received her doctorate of musical art from the Catholic University of America in piano performance. Her 3 songs are 一帘幽梦, Dream Links by Teresa Tang, Friendship Forever, 友谊地久天长, and Summer by Hisashi. Let's welcome Ma Gogo. absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. So next we will have a singer, Zhao Yuanxi, to come on stage. He is a Fulbright scholar from Taiwan and is a Chinese language teaching assistant at Catholic University of America, CUA. He will be performing a song called Tianlun Ge. It is the score of a film called Tianlun, one of the first Chinese movies that was played in the US. In this piece, the composer depicts the struggle of an orphan, and not only the desolation, but also a story of grace as well as healing. In this piece, the composer also combines aspects of Christianity and Confucianism into the lyrics, which you've heard a lot about in the recent panel. So feel free to sing along and also follow the songs and the translations in your handout. Wow, another fantastic piece. It really brought back some engaging memories and hope for all of us. we have a few poems that are going to be recited by 3 American guests in Chinese. And before we move on to the next part, I would like to mention a quote by John C.H. Wu, who we heard a little bit about from Dr. Liu today. He describes, "Poetry is the kernel of culture. It is an upwelling from the heart, and viewed as a national possession, it reveals what a people most strongly desires and believes. Chinese poetry is not distinct from the life and passions of the Chinese nation as a whole. And to study it is to look deep down into the very soul of our people. For only when a man is in a singing mood will he confess his innermost conviction." The first 2 poems that we'll hear today are read by Michaela Culp and Jacob Doyle. Both of them are currently taking their 2nd semester of Chinese at the Catholic University of America. Michaela is a freshman majoring in business administration, and Jacob is majoring in philosophy and pre-law. Michaela's poem is called "Seeing of a Friend" by Levi, and Jacob's poem is called "Farewells on a Grassland." Both of their poems will be accompanied by our pianist. First, I would like to welcome Michaela. Wow, again, a wonderful show of courage from our 2 students at CUA. So now we have one last poem for you. Dr. Steve Bala is a professor of political science at George Washington University, and he will recite for us a famous poem also by Levi called "Jiang Jing Jiu," Bring in the Wine. Dr. Bala and his family live in Silver Spring, Maryland, and they frequently go to China for family mission work. Let's welcome Dr. Bala.
君不见，黄河之水天上来，奔流到海不复回。君不见，高堂明镜悲白发，朝如青丝暮成雪。人生得意须尽欢，莫使金樽空对月。天生我材必有用，千金散尽还复来。烹羊宰牛且为乐，会须一饮300杯。岑夫子但求生，将进酒杯莫停。与君给一曲，请君为我 亲耳听。中古专语不足贵，但愿长醉不复停。古来圣贤皆寂寞，惟有饮者留其名。陈王昔时宴平乐，斗酒十千恣欢谑。主人何为言少钱，今须故去对君酌。五花马，千金裘，呼儿将出换美酒。与尔同销万古愁。
Hello, great to be here. So as Bakita said, in honor of the Year of the Tiger, I'm going to be teaching everyone how to make paper tigers. So super simple, everyone can do it, you know, even the kids. So all you need is really some paper. And if you, ideally it should be square, but if you have rectangular, I can teach you how to make it square later. And then you're gonna need some scissors, and you're also going to need some tape. In addition, in order to make the stripes in the eyes, you're gonna need some kind of black ink utensil. So what I have here is a Sharpie pen, but you can also use crayons, black ink pen, or any kind of markers. So without further ado, let's get started. So with your rectangular paper, you're really just going to, if it's rectangle, you're going to bring this edge to kind of the other end of the paper. So kind of, they call this folding a sail. So kind of like a sailboat. You have your kind of shape here. Yeah, if everyone's following along. And then basically, you're just gonna cut this part off so that you have a square. So I'm gonna do that real quick. Yeah. And yeah, it can be any colored paper you really want. I mean, like, if your favorite color is blue, feel free to get blue. I've personally never seen a blue tiger, but like, go off, you know what I mean? So, or you can do yellow or white, or you can do red for, you know, the auspiciousness of a Lunar New Year. So yeah, so with this flap, you're just gonna cut along the lines like so. Okay. And then once you cut off that flap, you're gonna have your square paper. So those following at home, I hope everyone understands. And then basically what we're gonna do next is we're going to prime the paper. So you've already folded it this way, and now we're going to fold it the other way. So bring the other edges together. So you're going to get a triangle like this. And so you can stay this way. And then what we're going to do is fold down the flaps. So bring this edge to the bottom and the other edge to also the bottom. So doing that. And once you've folded that together, you're going to get something like this, okay? And then what you're going to do is with the paper facing downward, you're going to fold up the edges like so. And these are going to be the ears of the tiger. So you're going to do that. And then at this point, I would highly suggest securing the flaps with tape, because when I was trying to do this before, it kind of went a little berserk. So we don't want that. So we're going to fold down the flaps like this. All right. So I'm going to give you some time to do that. I'm going to give myself some time to do this. Okay. Oh my gosh. Hold on. So the ears are not as perpendicular or not as symmetrical, but you know. Okay. Yes. So you're gonna get something like this. And then what you're gonna do is you're gonna fold down the sides of the face. So basically you're going to bring this flap in. Let me demo. So kind of like this. Don't know if anyone can see that. Okay. And then the other side as well. So we're going to get something like that. So I'm going to secure that with a tape as well. Okay. Okay, and then you're just gonna fold down the middle part over here. And then also tape that part down. Okay, and then at this point, you can also fold the ears back. So kind of like this, so it looks less like a fox and more like a tiger, hopefully. Yeah. Okay, and then, okay, and then you're going to fold up the bottom flaps this way. And then you're going to fold the other flap the other way. So like this. So it's like this. And then with the flap on the front, you're going to fold down again like so. So it's kind of like an upside down triangle, if you will. And I would also highly recommend taping these things down so they're secure in place. Okay, and then there you have the face of the tiger, and now you can start using your marker and just decorate however you want. So I'm going to draw eyes. And then you can also draw stripes for the tiger as well. Okay. Well, either way, you're gonna get a finishing product like so. So you can draw like stripes down the middle, and then color in the nose, and then you can draw the stripes on the side. And that's it. I hope you enjoy your new paper friend, and happy Lunar New Year. Thank you.
Wow, truly an extraordinaire. I can't believe what a wonderful finishing product. So on behalf of everyone here, I'd like to thank you again for tuning in from all around the world. And I'm really grateful that you have spent this afternoon with us celebrating the Lunar New Year. I hope that you learned something a little bit about Christianity beyond the East and West, and then you also enjoyed our performances for our lovely students today. So thank you all very much and have a wonderful day.